Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Gaby Villalobos. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is titled, High Hopes, Will Inflation Come Down? And we are excited to be joined by some great panelists. Today's panel will be moderated by Professor Rudy von Arman. He is Associate Professor of Economics and Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Economics at the University of Utah, and Senior Research Associate with the Austrian Foundation for Development Research in Vienna, Austria. He earned his PhD at the New School for Social Research in New York in 2008. His research focuses on the interaction between growth, employment, and the distribution of income in national and international contexts. And he has collaborated with UN, UNDP, UNCTAD, ILO, Oxfam, and other organizations on these themes. I will now turn it over to him to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm very excited to be here. This is my first in-person event, I want to say, since March 2020. Aside of a conference here and there that I've been at, but that the decline in the case numbers and hospitalizations is wonderful, and we can be here, all of here together with the panelists in the room. I'm going to introduce the topic briefly and then our panelists. In late 2021 and early 2022, inflation clocked in at 5 to 7%, depending on the specific statistic considered. This implies that currently the price of a typical consumer's basket of goods and services is increasing at more than twice the rate than has been observed on average in recent decades, and the president made the topic a centerpiece of the State of the Union address yesterday. At the same time, labor market indicators still show a mixed picture. The unemployment rate is near its pre-pandemic low, but prime age employment and labor force participation rates are roughly 3 percentage points below their respective peaks in the late 1990s. And importantly, real wages are currently falling. The corporate sector, on the other hand, is recovering strongly. Stock market indices have hit all-time highs at year's end. Corporate profits relative to value added are near their cyclical peaks, and margins have increased substantially. Amidst these signals, the Federal Reserve anticipates increases in interest rates to slow business investment, consumer demand, and hiring, and thus keep inflation in check. Our discussion today seeks to assess the ultimate causes of the observed surge in inflation and evaluate an appropriate policy response. In this context, the pandemic looms large. The COVID crisis triggered supply chain disruptions, a strong shift of consumption demand towards goods and away from services, and the Great Resignation. The horrific war in the Ukraine adds to these adverse supply shocks. Already before the pandemic, however, the economy was undergoing significant changes, some of which have persisted for decades. Inequality of income and wealth is rampant. Concentration of various forms of power in the hands of corporations and the ultra-wealthy has increased dramatically. And conflict over political representation is intensifying to dangerous levels, just as the climate crisis requires concerted political efforts and significant public investment. We might not be able to cover all of this ground today, but we'll try. And the challenge indeed is to place the current inflationary trends in this broader context and deepen our understanding of the relevant processes. Our three panelists are here to help us do this, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome and introduce these experts. Let me begin with Dr. Ivan Mendieta Munoz on your right. Ivan is Assistant Professor, the Macroeconomics Research Group Coordinator, and the PhD Program Faculty Placement Advisor in the Department of Economics here at the University of Utah. He received his PhD in Economics from the University of Kent in the UK in 2016. His areas of expertise are macroeconomics, monetary economics, and classical and Bayesian time series econometrics. He has received numerous awards for his academic work and has published more than 20 articles in academic journals. Next, and in the middle of the panel for you, is Dr. Marshall Steinbaum. Marshall is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Utah and a senior fellow in higher education finance at Jane Family Institute. He is an empirical labor economist by training with a PhD from the University of Chicago, and his research investigates the existence and implications of employer power in labor markets with applications to antitrust, higher education, and student debt. And last but not least, on your left is Phil Dean. Phil is the Kempsey Gardner Institute's Public Finance Senior Research Fellow. Previously, he served as former Governor Herbert's Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. In this capacity, he directed work on the Governor's budget recommendations, state revenue estimates, and economic analysis. He also serves as co-chair of the Utah Economic Council. Dean holds master's degrees in public administration from BYU and economics from the University of Utah. So a note on the proceedings, we're going to have opening statements from the panelists, beginning with Ivan, Marshall, and then Phil. There will be brief follow-up questions from me to have some discussion, and then we want to open it with roughly 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A from the audience. Ivan.
Thank you very much, Rudy, for that very kind introduction. So I was thinking how to perhaps begin this, and I came up with a broad overview of first the main explanations that have been provided in order to understand the current rise in inflation, and then some potential solutions in the sense of what policy recommendations can we talk about. So I think that there are mainly, broadly speaking, two main explanations as to why inflation has recently risen. Right, and one has, in a way or another, it's related to this idea of a wage price spiral that could get out of control. Right, so there's too much overall demand that, together with a tight labor market that has increased wages, together with, and therefore, higher wages, higher costs, and therefore higher inflation. The reason why I find this explanation to be a bit unsatisfactory is because. Mainly three main reasons, right? The first one is because really the bargaining power of workers has decreased, especially since the 1980s. So there has been a shift in the in the power dynamics between labor and capital. So currently, workers don't have too much bargaining power to actually negotiate higher wages. The second reason is that when we look at the January jobs report from the Labor Department, the data, what it's telling us is basically that most of the job gains have actually come from low-paid temporary workers that, again, have low bargaining power. So we're talking about leisure and hospitality workers. We're talking about retail and warehousing workers. And again, that gives doubts, that raises doubts about this explanation. At the same time, the U.S., in terms of the volume of jobs that have been generated, the U.S. economy is still around 3 million jobs less than what the U.S. economy had before the pandemic started. And thirdly, when we just look at the historical evidence, right, we know that there's a relationship between output, let's say output gap, and the unemployment rate and inflation, but the relationship is not so straightforward. So just to give you an idea, when the Great Recession started in 2007, there was this negative output gap, right? But actually there was no indication of deflation, and inflation actually just reduced by just a very moderate amount. So. And at the same time, some econometric evidence tells us that a 1 percentage point reduction in the unemployment rate only increases the inflation rate by around 1/3 of a percentage point. So the reduction in the unemployment rate cannot explain this huge spike in the inflation rate, in my opinion. What I think is more satisfactory and explanations of the recent rise in inflation should focus on are basically related to the idea of corporate power, right? So since the mid-1980s, right, there's the U.S. government abandoned antitrust enforcement, right? So since then, basically all American industries have increased in concentration, right? That has allowed them to increase their profit margins, by increasing the markup, right? And one of the explicit considerations in this sense by firms and industries has been to protect those profit margins. Nonetheless, they have earned high profit margins that are the highest over the last 70 years. So, I mean, the evidence is everywhere. I mean, just to tell you some quotations, right? The CEO of Kroger said last June that a little bit of inflation is always good in our business. And another one that I think is fantastic was the CEO of Colgate said that what we are very good is at pricing, right? So firms, I think that firms and large corporations have enough market power now to increase prices, and that has actually been the main explanation as to why inflation has risen, not so much aggregate demand. In terms of policy recommendations that I think can exist is, well, first of all, of course, the contractionary monetary policy, rising interest rates, right? But since the sources of demand are not mainly associated with demand, since the sources of inflation are not associated with demand at the moment, I think that won't help that much at the moment. So what actually this is going to be harmful, in my opinion. Workers, the economy will slow down, employment will contract, and actually this may create a situation similar to what happened in the 1970s when there was stagflation, right? So a contraction in economic activity together with rising inflation rates, because that's not controlling the actual sources of inflation. So another more promising area could be to actually try to reduce market power, right? Use antitrust laws to bust up monopolies, right? And the Biden administration has taken some steps into this direction, right? So, for example, the Agricultural Department has been instructed to investigate meat packers that have been rising inflation, their prices. Nonetheless, they have been increasing their profit margins by a factor of 3, right? So there are some directions into this that have been taken. There have been some steps taken into this direction, but at the same time, antitrust and law enforcement is extremely complex, and it may take a significant amount of time. We're talking about years here. So maybe some immediate steps that can be taken are to, well, first of all, perhaps introduce a windfall profit tax, right, applicable to all firms that may increase their prices at the same time that they are earning higher profit margins, for example, within the same quarter. And perhaps also introduce some type of price controls that are very targeted, right? Carefully selected price controls to specific goods and services, so for example, energy, consumer staples. And that would buy time to deal with the pandemic bottlenecks that have been generated, and also to prevent any type of anti-competitive behavior that is happening at the moment. So that's my broad overview.
Thank you so much, Ivan. That's wonderful. Marshall, you take it right away, because I think that gives you a good seg.
Sure. I don't actually have a ton to add to what Ivan was saying. Unfortunately, you've got a macroeconomist and then someone who studies market power, and it seems like we basically already agree, so we can just pack up and go home.
Maybe not.
Well, my general sort of hypothesis about why inflation has been higher, certainly than I expected, is basically that the pandemic economic policies have been a success. I think it's important to recognize that in reference to the last recession that we had in 2008 and 2009, when basically the recession, by the time the recession ended in early 2010, it still was many years before I would say the economy had reached full employment, if it even had in 2019 or 2020 when the COVID recession began. That was a matter of active debate in the scholarship at that time. So that reflects a very real policy failure of not having gotten aggregate demand such that the economy is producing at its full capacity over the course of like a 10-year recovery period. That didn't happen this time. There are a lot of more, I think, in some sense, lessons were learned that there needs to be fiscal expansion in response to reduction in willingness to spend and the other causes of the very acute crisis that occurred in early 2020. And so we had things like pandemic unemployment assistance that augmented the standard unemployment benefit. We also had stimulus checks, I think a total of 3 doses of that. The Paycheck Protection Program, which paid businesses to keep employees on the payroll rather than laying them off when their business disappeared, has been adjudicated to be a less successful policy ex post, mainly because essentially businesses that weren't going to lay off their workers anyway got loans. So in that sense, it was poorly targeted. But overall, the point being, it's possible to say in retrospect that this or that program was not a success or was poorly targeted or should have been structured in this other way. I think it's important not to get lost in that sort of critique and recognize the success that the response to the COVID pandemic represents, especially relative to where macroeconomic policymaking had been prior to its onset. On the other hand, that has given rise, in my opinion, to the inflation dynamics that we see now. So I think Yvonne is absolutely correct about the overall background of corporate power, of concentrated corporate power, giving firms the capacity to respond to increases in demand on the part of consumers by increasing prices. That is, they recognize a higher willingness and ability to pay on the part of their customers and can price accordingly. And normally what's supposed to happen, quote unquote, in the economy is that competition would prevail upon them not to increase prices. That is, even if consumers are able to pay higher prices, that other firms would come in and say, well, we'll still sell you this good for a lower price. And so that won't, that dynamic of increased demand won't necessarily give rise to overall across the board inflation. Here we don't have that competition dynamic at play. And so my view is that greater purchasing power on the part of households and individuals has fed through to higher prices because basically firms have the capacity to set higher prices. And that is itself a deflationary in some sense, or at least a contractionary fact about the economy. So if it's true that there's concentrated corporate power and thus prices will increase in response to households' increased income, then that kind of has its own, or the end of the inflation baked into the dynamics. There's a few other things at play. One I would say is during the pandemic, there's been a sort of aggregate shift in consumption away from services and towards goods in combination with a pre-existing supply chain that was highly attenuated and essentially very minutely engineered to not have a lot of spare capacity, that being considered an efficient way of organizing a supply chain, at least prior to the disruption to the global distribution. And so what we've seen now is that certain actors sitting at strategic points in the supply chain, like international shipping companies, have been able to earn much higher profits due to interruptions in supply. So consumers want more physical goods, fewer services, and overall their incomes have also gone up thanks to the pandemic supports I was referring to earlier. That sort of cascading through the global supply chain has meant that a very few actors sitting at strategic points can increase prices and increase profit margins, and it's basically consumers who will end up swallowing the cost of that. And then finally, to sort of conclude this, and get back to where I started about the success of the original pandemic support policies. They were especially augmented unemployment insurance and to a lesser degree the stimulus checks. Were premised on essentially supporting people's material condition outside the context of formal employment, aside from the Paycheck Protection Program. So there was an active debate in 2020 basically about how the federal response should be structured, and I can't tell you exactly why it shook out to be so focused on unemployment insurance, but probably because that was the system that was already in place, and so that was the one the feds went with in terms of how to augment the supports in the welfare state, basically, or the social insurance programs to support people who were put out of work by the pandemic. That inherently has a sort of destructive aspect in the labor market, which is that people who did have employment relationships had those employment relationships destroyed. They were nonetheless able to sustain themselves through these policies, but it's a lot, you could think of this as a machine that's a lot easier to turn off than it is to turn on. And I think what's happening now is that we made the policy choice to dissolve employment relationships, and now it's lengthy to get them started again. And to some degree, it has a sort of congestion aspect built into it, because I think a lot of workers have realized that basically there's ability to take outside job offers, and so that sort of makes it a lengthier process to get all of the employment relationships that did exist in 2019 back up and running. The other thing is, I think when I say that the economic response to the pandemic has been a success, the public health response has definitely not been a success. I think that goes without argument at this point. And that has economic repercussions, namely workers are rightly fearful of returning to the workplace when it's unsafe for them, and they lack the social supports that existed in 2020 and 2021, and access to the public health system, or to the healthcare system. And so a very interesting study about this just came out last week that basically indexes workers' desire to work with their actual employment, whether they have jobs and whether they have the number of hours that they want. So from the period 2010 to 2019, that index was reflected people not nearly working as much as they wanted to, both the people who were outside the labor force altogether, that is, or I should say outside employment altogether, so that were not having any work, as well as people who had fewer hours than they would have wanted. That index shows underemployment. What we have now, the same study shows, is overemployment by the same metric, meaning that workers are working more than they want to. The index of willingness or desire to work has declined precipitously during the pandemic and not recovered. And that, I think, reflects a valid judgment on the part of workers that the workplace is not a safe place and they risk endangering their families by going back to work, and no kind of posturing about, oh, actually, COVID's not that threatening, your children actually can't get COVID. I mean, we've heard all sorts of messaging from both the public health and economic establishment on that point, and I think it has been unsuccessful for good reason, because it's not true. And so workers are reluctant to return to work, and so these employment relationships that were destroyed by the policy choices made in 2020, it's going to be even more difficult to get them back into place. So that's my overall interpretation of why it's happened. I wasn't planning to get quite as specific as Yvonne did in terms of policy prescriptions to deal with it. I mean, the general concentration of corporate power in the economy is, absolutely a big problem. Not so easy to solve it on the timescale of several months to tamp down on inflation. So I completely endorse what Yvonne said to close out here, which is, price controls and corporate profits taxes are a good way to deter the price-raising behavior that I referred to earlier as the underlying cause.
Thank you so much, Marshall. It's wonderful. And you are both right on time, so Phil is taking his turn.
Okay. Sorry about that. So it's, I want to maybe take you back a little bit to, March 2020. I had heard, seen videos of things, right, of China and Italy. Like, I can remember these during the legislative session. Toward the end of legislative session, we're like, oh, this may come here. Like all of a sudden the paradigm starts changing, right? And you start thinking about economic activity and what that means for state revenue estimates at the state level. We had just adopted a budget based off not having, like, it was a conservative estimate like we usually do, but not necessarily incorporating a massive worldwide pandemic into the revenue estimates. So then March hits, kind of widespread panic. I don't know if you all remember, but like events related to Utah kind of started a lot of what happened here in the US. Like, it had been declared a global pandemic. That night, the Utah Jazz played a game. Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell are diagnosed with having COVID, right? And so what happened immediately? Like, they shut down they finished the games that night, but they canceled all future NBA games. The next day, what started happening, NCAA canceled things, canceled their tournament, which is like a massive thing, right? All of a sudden, a quick cascading, and in short order, you kind of had shutdowns. Either what we had here was not a legally binding thing, but it was a directive to stay home. In other places, it was legally binding. And all of a sudden, we went from what was a very strong economy, particularly here in Utah, but also nationally, to like the sand shifting under your feet, right? You guys remember those days? Like, what in the world is going on? I don't know anything, and this is the highly uncertain environment where the federal government starts its response. And that's where I'm going to spend some of my time following up. I think you covered it well, but I want to put some numbers to that. So there were a series of bills. I think of them as coming in 3 waves. The initial wave in March, a couple smaller bills, and then like that grew by orders of magnitude, every single bill, to where you have the CARES Act enacted at the end of March, which is amazingly fast for Congress to act that quick. Like, that's very unprecedented. But that was around a $2 trillion action taken by Congress. And then at the end of the year, Response and Relief Act, another $1 trillion. And then the American Rescue Plan Act under the Biden administration, another $2 trillion. So that's $5 trillion of fiscal stimulus. Certainly a portion of it directly related to the pandemic and pandemic response in terms of public health response, testing, vaccines, kind of all those sorts of things. But much of it wasn't targeted in that way to the public health response. It was to these broader economic impacts. And again, to provide some context for that $5 trillion, over $5 trillion that was enacted within a single year, although across fiscal years, that's 25% of US GDP in 2020. That's more than the federal government. In 2019, the federal government spending was about $4.4 trillion. So just think of the massive scale of what the federal government does, and this exceeded by 15, 20%, whatever it is, that amount. So this massive amount of fiscal stimulus. And I think there's very broad agreement about that initial round. The CARES Act, that bailed the economy out of what would have been. We were on the path to moving toward a Great Depression type situation. 20, 25, 30% unemployment, just these massive economic impacts because people had no certainty about what was going on, right? There was just this kind of chaos taking place. I remember being on calls with business leaders at that time. It's like, just give me certainty. Let me know. This is when the state's making decisions about what it's going to do in terms of its public health response. Like, I know we can't manage all these other things out there, but give me certainty with what the state's going to do in response to that. And so I think there's much less agreement about the Response and Relief $1 trillion and the $2 trillion for the American Rescue Plan Act. But I think it's really important to understand that context, and especially for me, that those later pieces were not targeted. So again, I'm going to relate this back to my own life. I remained employed, fortunately, throughout the entire pandemic, and I got a bunch of money from the federal government. So what did I do? We had been like saving up for a hot tub, so I'm like, okay, this is the time to get the hot tub. We've got a nice new basketball standard in our backyard. Did I need any of that? No, but it induced me to do spending, at least on a different time frame than what I would have done otherwise. That happened throughout the economy, and in the goods sector, right? So I don't know if you remember, but the service sector was largely shut down. We closed hospitals. We closed, hair salons, nail salons. We closed the Jazz games. We closed University of Utah, basketball and football game. We shut down services in the economy and sent a bunch of people money. So I don't think we can overstate the impact of the role of government in all of this. The government spending, again, I think especially that first portion of it was very essential. But now you look at accumulated savings that people have. You look at bank balances that are still sitting out there. To me, that's part of why there's so much uncertainty about inflation and the direction that it's going, because I don't know how and when people are going to spend the rest of this money. They spent part of it, but especially in the second and third bills, evidence I've seen says that people saved it or they used it to spend down debt. And so then we were like operating in this world of constrained supply with all the supply chain disruptions, which is certainly a contributing factor, but even as the supply chain works through, that's not going to like fully bring everything back to normal, because that's one piece of the puzzle. I agree that the lack of competition is a contributing factor, but I also don't think it's the only factor. I think there are a number of different pieces that came in together. And the other thing is that I think, particularly for Utah, but also nationally, I think inflation is understated. The official statistics, I think, aren't fully capturing what's happening in housing markets. That comes in through rents, is the way that that's estimated there, and that's showing 4%, I think, in the latest numbers, rent increases nationally, and I just don't think that's consistent, at least with what I'm not renting a house in other places, but I see double-digit rent increases, and certainly here for Utah, I'm seeing similar in rent. Separate from that, we have people trying to get into housing, to buy a home, and home prices have gone up that much. It's the other piece of that is people like me. If you look at that, you look at it from that aspect. Again, I'm one of those ones that benefited during the pandemic because I refinanced my home at a lower interest rate. I'm spending less on my home purchases because interest rates were so low, and now I've permanently freed up, a couple $100 in capacity that now is available for spending on other things. So I'm hesitant maybe to use this analogy in the current environment, and maybe I shouldn't, but I will anyway. A lot of times economically, we're fighting the last war. This isn't the Great Recession. This isn't a construction bust. I think that became very clear very early. It wasn't even necessarily, I think it was initially, but then not after that, a massive contraction in aggregate demand. Like, we didn't decide that we didn't want to travel anymore. Some people did. I still wanted to travel, right? I'm maybe I have a higher risk tolerance maybe than some people, but I wanted to travel. I couldn't travel, right? Some people were scared and didn't want to travel even if government would have allowed it. But I just think sometimes the problem was misdiagnosed up front, and not even saying that to be critical, because none of us really knew what was going on with this brand new virus out there that we're trying to respond to. But I think the federal government helped. I think that was critical, but I also think they overhelped, and we're dealing with some of those problems in a constrained supply environment.
Thank you so much, Phil. Wonderful. There's so many topics that you all raise. So I want to pick one out. We got to start somewhere. And I want to change up the order a little bit and throw this one to Marshall and then go to Phil and maybe reframe it for Ivan subsequently. But the question is about what you all have alluded to in different ways, the issue of supply shocks. There's, in the labor market, Marshall has talked about what is labeled the Great Resignation, and Phil brought it up in the context of this tremendous shift of demand away from services towards goods and the related supply chain constraints and these things. The question in the back of my mind here, or not really, in the front of my mind, is whether these supply shocks change the way we consider the relationship between labor markets and inflation and monetary policy. Marshall.
I wouldn't necessarily use the phrase supply shocks without, I'm not saying that no supply shock has occurred, but usually by that phrase what we mean is a leftward shift of an aggregate supply curve. And it seems to me like a better diagnosis is just that the aggregate supply curve is more steeply upward sloping, at least relative to baseline, than what people had predicted before the pandemic. So I'm not sure what would be considered a supply shock about what happened, economic policy or whatever. Possibly you could say what the Great Resignation counts as that, because the way I characterized it was workers have decided they want to supply less labor, and so now we have overemployment. So that may have some application of the supply shock, but to me, what's been revealed by this episode is that we have had a positive aggregate demand shock, and that has fed through to higher inflation than at least I would have expected it would have ex ante, and I think that's true of most economists, but I think can be perfectly understood ex post. I agree with Phil's characterization that we're in some ways fighting the last war. What I was saying about how the pandemic macroeconomic policy response was a success is basically that we did fight the last war and we won it pretty quickly, and that gave rise to a different set of economic circumstances that we're in now that raises the need for a different set of policies. To allude to some of the rest of the discussion, before the things like the second and third household stimulus checks went out, there was a lot of questioning of it along the lines that Phil mentioned, that they were poorly targeted, that they were going to be saved rather than spent, and so they were not very good economic stimulus. My view at the time was basically that doesn't matter when what you're dealing with is a recession. I basically take a sort of what I would call an old Keynesian approach to macro. I don't know if that's still current with you guys, but that the goal is not to perfectly tailor every policy so it's getting exactly into the right hands, especially since the way that we actually have to do that in and administer such programs makes programs less effective. So I think one thing that was effective about the stimulus programs that were enacted is exactly that they were not too concerned with it going into the wrong hands. That made it a more effective macroeconomic stimulus. Anyway, to some degree, what Phil said is right. Plenty of people got stimulus checks that didn't quote unquote need it, in the sense that they didn't spend it on food and to feed their families, but instead paid down debt and saved it. I think that's part of why there's a housing price boom now, is that the stimulus checks plus the student debt repayment pause made it so that more people could afford down payments, and so there was sort of a move into the housing market. I just want to make the point that all of that is anti-inflationary. That is contractionary behavior, because what we would expect to cause inflation is everybody taking their stimulus check and running to the grocery store or going on online shopping binge or something like that. That's what would give rise to an inflationary spiral, not people saving and paying down debt. And and I think, housing is an interesting question, because it's undoubtedly the case that we're in a housing price boom, and I think part of that is caused by what sort of seems like saving from a household consumption savings decision perspective can give rise to prices going up in the housing market, which feeds through the rent. So that I would say sort of fitting that into an overall macroeconomic framework is above my pay grade. So I'll defer to you guys on solving that problem. But to me, that looks more like saving behavior, not like consumption behavior that would be considered to be inflationary.
Yeah, so I'll just follow up on that. Saving represents future consumption, right? So it's a question of timing. When does that money actually come into the economy in the form of consumption? I guess one of my other follow-ups is I was one of those ones internally. This is one of the fun things when you're in a chief economist, budget director role, that you kind of say some things internally and don't say other things. Don't say those same things externally. But after the CARES Act passed, I was telling the economists on my team, first of all, we're going to be okay now. Like, people don't understand the scale of how large that was. We got roughly $1 billion for the state that we had to spend by the end of the year. Try spending $1 billion, and it had to be like spent, not just allocated. Try to receive services for $1 billion worth of goods and services to the state within 7-month period. It's actually hard to spend money that fast, that much money that fast, especially in a constrained supply environment. So I told them, we're going to be okay, first of all. Second of all, assume all of these relationships that you're running all these regressions off are wrong. Like, start from scratch. Some of them may end up still remaining the same, but we always equate things to other things and how they respond. That's not the case anymore. Just the one example I would consistently bring up at the time is when unemployment goes up, incomes drop. And that did not happen, right? In part because of the untargeted, but in part because of the piece that was very targeted. You hear the $600 weekly benefit and think, well, it's $600, it's not that much, right? And then you start thinking, wait a minute, that's $15 an hour for a 40-hour, and that's on top of the regular unemployment insurance benefit. So that was like an add-on. So like the minimum is somewhere around $22, $23 an hour. And so we started looking at this, and I think it was somewhere around April or May. But you look for the Utah economy, 90% of people on unemployment insurance had higher incomes than they had prior to being laid off. And So like these relationships changed. Now all of a sudden unemployed people, not just people in general that got stimulus checks, unemployed people have not only replacement income, but more than replacement income. And you look at the aggregate data, this shows up all over the place, right? These spikes, I think it was the second quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021, and you see very significant amounts. So then that translates, again, some of it to increases in spending. So I don't think it's permanently broken these relationships, but the one thing I have found is people usually make economic decisions incrementally, and you kind of get in habits, right? And so it's like, oh, this is my routine for my monthly budget. This is when I go shopping. These are the things I buy. Like we just get these regular habits, and something like this disrupts those habits. And some of those habits are going to persist and they're going to stay there long term, but other habits are going to change. And I don't know in terms of the service sector in particular, right? We're more open now. There's still, I think, frictions to like, I don't like wearing masks, and I'd rather drive somewhere than fly if it's within a reasonable distance, because I think there just aren't that good of benefits, especially on a plane. So maybe I'm not going to fly, maybe I'll drive. But then there are people that really are worried, right? That I maybe disagree a little bit here in terms of public health and some of the failings of public health in response to the pandemic. I think people aren't very good at numbers and understanding risk and calculating risk. And I want to say this diplomatically, but I think that was taken advantage of some during a lot of people have much greater risk driving in to the university today than they did for some of the, at least most extreme outcomes from the pandemic. And so I just think there are these ongoing, there are some people that I think aren't going to fly again. And just last piece, I think there's some long-term impacts educationally, which are going to translate into economic effects from the response to the pandemic as well.
Thank you, Phil. That's wonderful. I think it's important to emphasize that a very large number, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans have died due to the COVID pandemic, and the risks are not imaginary.
I agree.
I also think that my own, just as a side note that nobody needs to pay attention to, my own risk exposure has always been irrelevant to me, because the relevant concern is whether I infect others. I get through this with good health insurance and a healthy body and no risk profiles very well. I always understood that. It's not about me, it's about others. It's a way, I just want to juxtapose that to your characterization of people's mistakes in risk calculation. Last question.
And I want to respond to that at some point, but.
Last question goes to Ivan. Thank you, Phil. Last question goes to Ivan. To reframe slightly the question about supply shocks, which is supply shocks or supply shifts. I think that's a great question to consider, whether this is which of it is. The question for the macroeconomist on the panel pertains to inflation expectations, of course. All of these, may this be a shift or a shock? In fact, which of it is perceived to be might be relevant for whether we consider inflation expectations to change. And whatever the source of the rise in inflation is, if expectations de-anchor, the story changes. I want to ask Ivan, how so, and how do you assess the risk that the current episode, still considered transitory probably, but how do you assess the risk for inflation expectations to de-anchor?
Yeah, well, I think that's precisely right. I mean, indeed, so there are two components, right? So there is the transitory cyclical effect, right? And then there's the long run, medium run concept of how expectations are driven. So now in the current situation, I think that because inflation, I mean, we're just observing this over the last few months, perhaps over a year. I don't think that this is still, we can talk about this as a medium run, long run concept. I think that that for that to happen, this situation may need to continue at least, or let's say inflation should continue persistently high, around 7-8% over the next 5 to 10 years, which in my opinion is unlikely to happen. So, but if that keeps going, then I think that indeed inflations will be the anchor from the target set by the central bank, and that would create further problems. Yeah, that's basically my take, right? So to what extent really the central bank can influence expectations rather than influencing what is happening in the short run, that's something debatable, but I don't see that expectations will be anchor in the current situation.
Can I ask Ivan a question?
Please.
Just to usurp your role as moderator.
Please.
So a few months ago, the federal senior economist at the Federal Reserve Board published a paper basically saying that inflation expectations have nothing to do with inflation. So this is totally at odds with received wisdom among economists who do macroeconomic policy. So do you think that is correct, that inflation expectations don't matter at all?
Well, I mean, I don't. I remember reading a bit of that paper. Yeah, that's a very interesting take. I mean, statistically speaking, they have to do with the behavior of inflation, right? Because it's like a long-term trend that affects the behavior, right? To what extent that has nothing to do with the underlying forces? That's I think that's the main point of the article. And I really, to be honest, I haven't really decided what road to take there. So
there is a nice short 2016 paper by Blanchard who basically says the same thing, that expectations have no role in determination of inflation until they do. which is always like inflation expectations don't matter until they truly become de-anchored, and when and how that happens is difficult to assess or forecast. But I think the agreement among macroeconomists is that they have not yet de-anchored. But with that,
can I jump in on that? So that's what the Federal Reserve survey shows, right? That you look at the 1 year compared to the 3 year and the 5 year, and they're different.
Yes.
The thing I'll add to that is that that can change very quickly. You look at how quickly the 1 year thing, and it's like people not worried. Boom, people worried instantaneously. And so I don't think it happens as quickly at the long term, but I also don't think it takes 3 years or 5 years for that to become unanchored. That can happen in a matter of months or 1 to 2 years. I don't think it takes a long time for those to become de-anchored.
Thank you, Phil. I want to really draw a line and hand this now to the audience. So we have somebody with a mic to collect questions, and I invite you all to pick up where we left off or to change the topic as long as we stick roughly with inflation. Is that a question? Oh, there's a hand, please.
Hello, thank you all for coming today. It's been super informative. I wanted to ask about the resurgence of unions that we're seeing, at least in terms of media presence. We had like a Starbucks that tried to unionize. They were successful, but also an Amazon warehouse. How do you see the role of kind of labor resistance and unions playing a part in decreasing corporate power, or if you see that there's any traction with that?
I'll leave that to Marshall.
You want to take that, Marshall?
Sure. I mean, so it's definitely true that there's been some increase in interest in unionization and in strike activity relative to the last couple of years. It's still not as high as it was in 2018 and 2019 with the so-called Red for Ed strike. So teachers' unions tend to be larger. That was a larger sort of nationwide movement. What you're referring to is a couple of different companies where there have been, at least Starbucks being the big one, where there's been a successful de novo unionization effort, and then some other companies where there are pre-existing unions that have gone on strike where previously they haven't gone on strike or asked for more than they have in the past. I do think that is connected to the so-called Great Resignation, the decline in desire to work. I think that in some specific areas in the labor force, the apprehension on the part of workers that employers are more desperate for workers than they have been before gives rise to the conditions under which unions that exist already think, oh, well, going on strike now is actually a good idea, whereas they would have not thought that in the past. So I think it's a component, but in terms of the sort of aggregate importance of it in the overall labor market dynamics, I think a relatively small one, at least so far. I mean, the way that unionization has happened in American history is always chaotic in the sense that, there's like big episodes where lots and lots of workers unionize, and then kind of dissipation of union representation over a long period of time. In some cases, there's been, also steep declines at a given point in time. So we're not yet in the part where we could say that we are in one such episode where a lot more workers are unionized now than they have been previously. It would be premature to say that, but I do think that the episodes that we've seen reflect, it's like one aspect of the overall Great Resignation phenomenon.
I would just add that I think it's very important, right? The role of unions in fighting corporate power, right? So I think I agree with Marshall. I just wanted to make my position clear about that.
Any other
So
questions?
can I ask a follow-up question, maybe? Sorry again to.
No, go ahead.
Do you see any difference between the role of public sector unions and private sector unions?
Well, I mean,
because government isn't going to go bankrupt. That's the risk, right? They have to balance that where.
Well, so what you're saying is sort of a very broad and I would say temporally inspecific question of like whether there's a different, whether we should treat as a matter of policy unionization in the private sector versus the public sector. I don't think that has a lot. I mean, one interesting fact about what's happening now, the Starbucks, Amazon, and the John Deere and Yahtzee and the Kellogg strike. So these were, those latter ones were pre-existing unionized workplaces that chose to go on strike or at least come near to it in the course of contract negotiations. Those are all in the private sector. The 2018 to 2019 Red for Ed strikes, that was more public sector union militancy, whereas previously public sector unions had been very unmilitant, I would say, in their disposition towards employers. I would say, there's good reason. It is definitely because, or I should say, the fact that there's much more activity right now or in the last couple of months in the private sector does definitely reflect that. That's one of the ways you can say it's a part of the Great Resignation, because there's been less job destruction in the public sector than in the private sector. And that job destruction ended up redounding to the benefit of workers in the form of labor shortages and increased wages. So that one of the ways that I'm comfortable, or one of the reasons I'm comfortable saying that this episode of unionization, whatever you want to call it, or union strike activity is due to the Great Resignation, or component part of the Great Resignation is exactly that public versus private distinction. I would say, just to speak very briefly to the broader question that you're asking about, whether we should view unionization in the public versus the private sector as two, kind of different policy questions. I mean, basically, private sector unionization is, at least since the 60s, has been more contentious. So it used to be that the public sector was much less unionized than the private sector, and that polarization has completely reversed. And I think that is in part because of the different government. I mean, it's a lot. It's not in part. It's driven by the policy treatment and legal environment in which unions would operate in both the public and the private sectors. So maybe we will see. I mean, this it's very early days to predict a reversal like this. Maybe there's ongoing hostility to public sector unionization. At the same time, there's much more militancy and organizing going on in the private sector. So maybe we will go back to a pre-1961 balance where there's more private sector union workers than public sector union workers, but we're not anywhere near that yet. I mean, even with all the strike activity and de novo unionization that's going on, the share of the workforce that's unionized is still on its long-term downward march. That is mostly on a year-to-year basis. That's due to the fluctuations in employment numbers at unionized workplaces, but at a decades-long timescale, that is definitely due to the hostile legal environment towards private sector unionization and a growing hostile legal environment for public sector unionization as well.
Okay, Steve has a question.
A couple of observations I'd like comments on. One, I think by historical measure, this was the most successful fiscal stimulus ever in the United States. The length of the recession was 2 months, which the shortest recession in history. The inflation that we're seeing now is episodic, meaning specific to various segments, various sectors. So food to some degree, parts of food chain. Gasoline because of the oil market. To some degree on housing, as Phil noted. And in automobiles, mainly in used car prices, and also new car prices. And each of those has different causes, right? And that accounts for a majority of the inflation that we're seeing. So it's not widespread. It's painful because, especially in the food chain, we go shopping several times a week, so we notice that. And we should take care, to the degree we can come up with specific policies to deal with those issues. As Yvonne mentioned when he was talking about price controls, which I agree with. That's one observation. Sorry for being long-winded here. The second is that I think the last time I looked, real productivity is up significantly through the period. And at the end of the day, almost no matter what happens with inflation, if that holds, in the long run, the economy's going to be actually healthier coming out of this episode than it would have been otherwise.
That's an optimistic note. I almost want to close on that note, but we're not gonna do that. We still have a moment. So the floor is still open if somebody has a question. Otherwise, I would like to focus for the last couple of minutes on Utah. In some way, this goes, of course, to Phil, who has all the expertise here in the local government, but anybody please chime in. The big question, and I'm so glad that Steve brings this up, that inflation, the sources of inflation are very narrow in specific goods and areas, particularly used cars and commodities. In that sense, the Ukraine war will exacerbate energy prices and so on, particularly in Europe, of course, but with the attendant repercussions. The question in Utah, I believe, and has been alluded to, is about housing costs. What role does that play in inflation, and what adverse effects will increases in interest rates have on extending the housing supply?
So I mean, interest rates, let me start with the latter part of that. Interest rates have gone from 3% to 4% basically for mortgage interest rates, within a month and a half. I haven't seen anything slowing down in terms of the housing market. Again, I think the challenges here are much less about demand. We're seeing increases in demand for housing. You look at millennials aging into that normal. A lot of times there's this discussion of, millennials are never going to want to buy a house. Yep, they do want to buy houses. They were cautious coming in, but now they're coming in full bore, and we have another 5 to 10 years of home purchases there. So again, here's where I think governments are artificially constraining what the market would do. Builders would build a lot more housing if they were allowed to do that. Even with an increase in interest rates, I think that tamps that down some. I don't think it reverses it. I think it tamps it down. I think it gets second home buyers and some of the less essential purchases. It maybe moderates there. But in terms of home prices, you look at who's purchasing homes and driving up prices, very high credit scores. This isn't the Great Recession, the run-up to the Great Recession, lax lending taking place in housing markets. So I think we're going to continue, and as long as we continue to see constrained supply, we still have, even with the massive building over the last 3 years, we've still over the last decade have 40-some-odd thousand households created than homes built. It's just this fundamental imbalance, and until we work through that, I think we're going to continue to see that. And again, the thing that worries me with inflation in general, I'm not sure I completely agree with Steve that inflation's only in a couple of categories. Almost every category is seeing it, but used car, not every category seeing the 40% inflation that's in used cars, by the way, not new cars. See if I can get it out here. So who does that impact? It's low-income people are hit most on the used cars, on the food, on the housing. Those are the people that are most feeling rent increases and new people trying to get in to the housing market for the first time. And that's where my greatest concerns are of, yes, it may be a temporal thing that it goes for a year or two or whatever, but it's causing real challenges for people, especially at the low end of the economic spectrum. And it's nice to say it's transitory, and for people that can have the ability to navigate around it because they have more resources, that's fine. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, it's a lot harder thing to deal with.
Thank you. Ivan, do you have a last thought on housing and inflation and macroeconomics?
Well, just wanted to clarify again. The issue with saving is precisely. I agree with Marshall. That's not demand, right? That, as you said, it goes into the future. So that's why the demand side explanation, I think, is not entirely correct in the current situation, right? And no, I mean, I think again, I think I'm more with Steve on this one. That I think the increase might be just temporary. I'm not saying that this year. I don't think that this year prices will fall. Actually, right? I think that we're still gonna be seeing inflation rates between 7% and 8%. But I think maybe next year the inflation will slow down. That's my reading of the evidence. I don't think this is a permanent, meaning over the next 5 years we will continue with this situation. That's more a temporary phenomenon. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. If that counts for optimism, we'll take it. Thank you for the discussion.